He worked for the CIA for 31 years. He spoke Russian. He ran counterintelligence. He handled the agency's most sensitive Soviet operations. He debriefed defectors. He knew the names of every Soviet officer working secretly for the United States. And every year, for 9 years, he drove to meet KGB officers in Washington and Rome and Vienna. And he told them everything he knew. His name was Aldrich Ames. At least 10 people were executed because of what he sold. Welcome to Shadow Archives. In 1985, the CIA's Soviet East European Division was one of the most important offices in American intelligence. Its job was to recruit, manage, and protect Soviet officers who had agreed to spy for the United States. These were men who had given up everything, their careers, their safety, in some cases their lives, to pass information to the West. The division held their identities in secret. It was the most sensitive information the agency possessed. Aldrich Ames had been with the CIA since 1962. He had joined as a records analyst while still in college. Following his father into the agency, he had learned Russian. He had served overseas in Ankara, New York, and Mexico City. By 1985, he was 43 years old and had spent more than 2 decades inside the intelligence community. He had access to virtually every CIA and FBI source operating against the Soviet Union. He was also, by 1985, in serious financial trouble. He had divorced his first wife and was paying alimony. He had married a second time, a Colombian woman named Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy, who he had recruited as a CIA asset. She had expensive tastes. He had a government salary. The gap between what he earned and what he spent was growing wider every month. On April 16, 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C. He brought an envelope. Inside was a piece of paper with the names of 3 KGB officers who had been recruited by the FBI as double agents, men the Soviets did not know had been compromised. Ames later said he had intended it as a one-time transaction, a scam to get money. He expected $50,000. The KGB gave him exactly that. One payment did not remain one payment. The KGB saw what Ames was worth. They told him they wanted more. They offered him $2 million for continued cooperation. Ames, who had described his initial approach as low risk, found himself calculating whether the reward justified the exposure. He decided it did. 2 months later, on June 13, 1985, he met a KGB contact in Washington and handed over a package. The package contained the names of virtually every Soviet officer working secretly for CIA and FBI. Ames had pulled together everything he knew, every asset, every operation, every contact he had accessed in his years inside the Soviet division. He gave them names. He gave them locations. He gave them operational details. The list was comprehensive. Later analysts called it the single most damaging espionage act against the United States in the history of the Cold War. The KGB moved immediately. Within weeks, Soviet officers who had been working for American intelligence began to disappear. They were recalled to Moscow. They were arrested. They were tried. Some were executed. By the end of 1985, the CIA had lost nearly every active asset inside the Soviet Union. Recruitment ground to a halt. The agency's window into Soviet decision-making, built over 20 years, was gone. The CIA knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. Assets were disappearing too fast, across too many countries, in too coordinated a pattern to be coincidental. A senior officer at the time described the losses as the worst in the history of our service. In 1986, the agency assembled a special team, a mole hunt, to find the source of the leaks. They looked everywhere. They did not look at Ames. The red flags were not subtle. After the first payment from the KGB, Ames paid off $40,000 in debt within a few months. He began driving a Jaguar, a car that cost more than his annual CIA salary. He and Rosario purchased a house in Arlington, Virginia for $540,000. in cash. He renovated it extensively. When colleagues asked where the money was coming from, he said Rosario's family in Colombia was wealthy. No one verified this. In 1986, Ames was transferred to Rome. He continued passing information to the KGB through the Soviet consulate and through dead drops, concealed locations around the city where he would leave documents and pick up cash. By 1989, the KGB had paid him $1.88 million. Back in Washington after 1989, he continued the operation using dead drop sites around the Capitol, mailboxes, chalk marks on utility poles, strips of tape as signals, tradecraft he had learned inside the CIA. In 1986 and again in 1991, Ames was required to take CIA polygraph examinations. Both times, the results showed deceptive answers. Both times, the examiners assessed the anomalies as minor and inconclusive. The 1991 examination, conducted after the mole hunt had been running for 5 years, noted inconsistencies and cleared him anyway. The CIA's polygraph program, which was supposed to catch exactly this kind of threat, missed it twice. The KGB, for their part, worked to protect Ames. When the CIA's mole hunt began focusing on potential suspects, Soviet intelligence ran a disinformation campaign designed to deflect attention. They pointed investigators toward the Warrenton Training Center in Virginia, a completely innocent facility. The CIA spent a year investigating nearly 100 employees there. Ames was not among them. He continued working. He continued passing documents. He continued collecting payments. The CIA and FBI finally opened a serious joint investigation of Ames in late 1993, 8 years after he had first approached the Soviets. Investigators began going through his trash. They found torn drafts of notes he had written to his KGB handlers. They tapped his phone. They tracked his car using a light aircraft. They found a pattern of contacts, travel, and unexplained wealth that could no longer be explained away. On February 21, 1994, FBI agents arrested Aldrich Ames outside his home in Arlington, Virginia. He was on his way to CIA headquarters. He had a meeting scheduled. His wife, Rosario, was arrested separately. When agents searched the house, they found classified documents, KGB communications, and records of payments going back years. Ames did not resist. He later said he had always known it would end this way. In his guilty plea, Ames admitted that he had compromised virtually all Soviet agents of the CIA and other American and foreign services known to him. He acknowledged giving the Soviet Union a huge quantity of information on United States foreign, defense, and security policies. At least 10 people were executed as a direct result of what he sold. Others were imprisoned. The intelligence network the CIA had built over 20 years inside the Soviet Union was gone. The Senate Intelligence Committee's 1994 assessment of the case was direct. The CIA had failed at every level. The mole hunt had been inadequately resourced, poorly coordinated, and had operated for years without producing results. The polygraph program had failed. The financial monitoring program had failed. Supervisors who had noticed Ames's drinking, his performance problems, and his unexplained wealth had not acted on what they observed. Ames was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. His wife, Rosario, received 63 months. Under his plea agreement, Ames forfeited his assets. $547,000 was turned over to a victim's assistance fund. He spent the next 30 years in federal prison, giving occasional interviews, occasionally questioning the value of intelligence work, occasionally suggesting that the damage he had caused had been exaggerated. He died in January 2026 at the age of 84. The question that haunted the CIA after the Ames case was not how he had evaded detection for 9 years. It was why the signals had been there for 8 of those 9 years and had been ignored. The Jaguar, the house, the cash renovations, the failed polygraphs, the performance reviews that noted problems but did not escalate them, the mole hunt that investigated everyone except the most obvious candidate. Each of those signals, individually, might be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that was unmistakable. The answer the Senate committee gave was institutional. The CIA in 1985 was not designed to suspect its own officers. Its entire operating premise was that the people inside were trustworthy, that the screening process, the loyalty checks, the polygraphs, had produced a workforce that could be trusted with the secrets of the state. That premise made it structurally very difficult to act on evidence that one of its own was betraying it. Ames had been inside for so long that he was part of the furniture, and the furniture, by definition, does not betray you. The Ames case did produce changes. The CIA restructured its security and counterintelligence programs. It created new financial disclosure requirements for officers in sensitive positions. It revamped how polygraph results were assessed and acted upon. It established a more aggressive mole hunting capacity. None of that brought back the assets who had been executed. None of it reconstructed the intelligence network that had taken 20 years to build and 9 months to destroy. For years after Ames was arrested, the FBI caught Robert Hanssen, another American intelligence officer who had been spying for the Soviets and Russians for more than 20 years. Hanssen had passed information that, in the assessment of some analysts, was even more damaging than what Ames had sold. The institutional failures the Ames case had exposed had not, in the end, been fully corrected. Aldrich Ames' story is often told as a story of betrayal. One man's greed destroying decades of work and costing 10 lives. That is accurate, but the more unsettling version of the story is not about the man who betrayed the agency. It is about the agency that made it possible. Ames did not hide his guilt very well. He spent money he could not explain. He drove a car he could not afford. He failed polygraphs. He told people his wife was from a wealthy family and no one checked. The CIA did not catch him because it was not looking. The 10 people whose names Ames sold to KGB on June 13, 1985 were not abstractions. They were officers and officials who had made a calculation that passing information to the West was worth the risk. They had trusted the CIA to protect their identities. Ames sold that trust for $2.5 million. There's a file drawer at CIA headquarters that contains their records. Tim Weiner, who covered the case from its beginning, wrote that Ames's betrayals filled 25 deep file drawers of intelligence at the agency and emptied the lives of everyone in them. Next file. The alarm at NORAD that put American bombers on the runway with their engines running, caused by a computer chip that cost 46 cents. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Subscribe and unlock the archives. New file every week. I will see you in the next one.